Diane Nash came from Chicago and went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was there that she became a leader in the movement. We're back where I'd like to be. Okay, so we know about Diane, her early background. So she goes to Fisk University, and she comes to Fisk University at a very critical time. This is when the students in Nashville are beginning to do the training under Reverend James Lawson, the nonviolent training. Nashville had 5 African-American higher education institutions. There was Fisk University, there was the American Baptist Theological Seminary, there was Tennessee A&I, which later became Tennessee State, Meharry Medical College. It was an abundance of African-American students, and James Lawson began teaching them nonviolence. In 1960, the students of Nashville began the lunch counter sit-ins. Of course, the first sit-in had occurred in North Carolina, but the students in Nashville were trained in nonviolence. Diane Nash became the leader of the sit-in movement in Nashville, not because she wanted to be, but because the male leaders had a habit of just not showing up in critical moments. So Diane stepped forward, and everyone knew and respected her, and she became the leader. She had a famous confrontation with the mayor of Nashville. We saw that in the first film clip. And she asked the mayor, do you think that it is morally right to have segregated lunch counters? And the mayor, to his credit, said no, he did not think it was correct to have segregated lunch counters. And in a very short time, Nashville became one of the first southern cities to desegregate their facilities. The following year was the year of the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Riders started out from Washington, D.C., and their goal was to ride to New Orleans in an integrated buses. But that did not happen. In Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses was burned. When the Freedom Riders got to Birmingham, Alabama, they were badly beaten. So badly beaten that they were unable to continue the Freedom Ride. But the students in Nashville decided that the Freedom Rides should continue, so they went down to Birmingham and got on the bus, went and continued the Freedom Rides. Diane was an organizer, the voting rights campaign in Selma, and participated in many of the early campaigns. A strong advocate of nonviolence. She also was an anti-war activist at the time of the Vietnam War, and continues to be an activist and a teacher at the present time. So I'm going to skip the video links. Well, let me talk about the video link. Those of you who've seen The Eyes on the Prize are familiar with this scene where the representative from Robert Kennedy is in Nashville trying to negotiate. And he knows that the students from Nashville are coming down. He talks to Diane Nash and says, "Can't you stop? Don't you know what's in store for you?" And Diane calmly tells him, "We have written out our last wills and testaments, and we are prepared for anything that might happen." I think the political leaders The people who were sent there to try to plead with the students to stop the freedom rides did not appreciate the degree of dedication that they had. And certainly Diane Nash was, an example for that. She continued organizing and spent some time in Mississippi. In 1962, Diane was facing a 2.5-year jail sentence because she had been encouraging young high school students to participate in freedom rides. The judge was willing to dismiss the charges if she would leave the state, but that was not in Diane's character. She told the judge that she would be willing to go to jail because she believed that that would help to hasten the day when her child and all children would be free. The judge relented and shortened the sentence from 2.5 years to 10 days. And so she passed her time there washing her clothes and watching the cockroaches. Now, James Chaney is someone that most people who've studied the civil rights movement know about. Chaney is 1/3 of the Freedom Summer trio of Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney, the 3 young men who were murdered outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi in the summer of 1964. What many people didn't know, and Kim, I believe it was you were the one who first told me that James Chaney was a Catholic. And I've since done some research on this and found out that, yes, indeed, his family, his siblings were Catholic, that he was baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church. He and his siblings attended St. Joseph Catholic School in Meridian, Mississippi. That went through the 8th grade. In 9th grade, he went to the public high school, but the public school experience was not too good for James. He got suspended for wearing an NAACP button to school. The principal and the administration didn't like that, and eventually he was expelled from the public high school for his civil rights activism. He worked for a while for his father, who was a plasterer, but eventually began working full-time for the Congress of Racial Equality in 1963. When Mickey Schwerner came to Mississippi in January 1964, he worked very closely with Mickey and Rita Schwerner in establishing a community center for young people there in Meridian. Of course, we know that at the very beginning of the Freedom Summer, the civil rights workers disappeared. And there was a massive search. Lyndon Johnson mobilized the FBI. You get the feeling that they were not too keen about searching for missing civil rights workers, but Lyndon Johnson had a way of getting what he wanted. Navy personnel were searching as well. One of the video links that I have here shows the wife of Mickey Schwerner, Rita Schwerner, who came to Mississippi And you probably are not going to be able to hear this.
If they did, I feel like they asked for it.
It was always on our minds. And we
The dirt road, every alley in the county.
the press swarmed all over her. And I think they wanted her to cry. And they wanted her to be a new widow. They would catch her at the moment of.
I suspect that if this is Mr. Chaney, who is a native Mississippian Negro, typing along at the time of the disappearance, that this case, like so many others that have come before, would have gone completely unnoticed.
I did have some sense that if the story was allowed to deteriorate into, oh, this poor little white girl.
So I don't know that you were able to hear it. What she's saying is that had it been James Chaney alone who disappeared, the government never would have paid any attention to it. But because he was accompanied by two young white men, the search was much greater than anything that had happened previously. After 44 days, the bodies of Goodman, Schwerner, and Chaney were found buried beneath a farm dam. And they were only found because the FBI had been able to identify Ku Klux Klan members, and one of the Ku Klux Klan members revealed the burial location. 18 people, including the sheriff and the deputy sheriff of Neshoba County, were indicted for civil rights offenses, but no one from that group was indicted for murder until 2005, where finally one of the 18 who was identified as being responsible was convicted. We're going to move from Mississippi to Louisiana, and this is a person whom I suspect most people are not familiar with. A.P. Tureaud, Alexander Pierre Tureaud, was a civil rights lawyer in Louisiana, in New Orleans. He was descended from free people of color and remained deeply rooted in New Orleans. There was no place to go to law school in Louisiana, not if you were African American. So he wound up at Howard University, and he was there at a very important time because Charles Hamilton Houston was the dean of the Howard University Law School and was preparing a whole group of young lawyers who would be taking on the separate but equal clauses of the Plessy decision. So Tureaud returns to Louisiana in 1927 and begins working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. His cases during that time, many of his cases focused on equalization, still working with the separate but equal doctrine. He argued that African American teachers should be paid comparably to white American teachers. For a long period, he was the only African American lawyer admitted to the bar in the state of Louisiana. He worked closely with Thurgood Marshall and other NAACP lawyers, handled many civil rights cases, And the most important cases he was working with were suits to bring integrated education to Louisiana. Here we see him with Thurgood Marshall. They were co-counsels together in many of the important cases. Probably the two most important cases that were initiated by A.P. Tureaud were the desegregation of Orleans Parish Public Schools. The case started in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, and dragged on for 16 years before it was finally resolved. He was also instrumental in bringing about the desegregation of the Louisiana State University. First in the law school and the graduate school and the medical school, and then later in the undergraduate school. This is A.P. Tureaud Jr., who was the first African-American student to attend Louisiana State University in 1953. We don't usually hear about his integration of LSU because he was soon kicked out of the school. His presence there caused such an uproar. And of course, it was his father who was instrumental in making that integration happen. So Tureaud was a lifelong Catholic, member of the Knights of St. Peter Claver, and his religion was a part of his activism. Okay, now we're going to fast forward here. Perhaps you can identify the scene here. This was in Selma, Alabama, in March of 1965. And the reason you were seeing this picture is because of, in the foreground, Sister Antona Ibo, who's one of the Catholic sisters who participated in the demonstrations in Selma following the attack of Bloody Sunday. She was part of a interracial group coming from St. Louis. The Archbishop of St. Louis chartered a flight. Dr. King said he wanted people of faith to come to Selma, and Catholics from around the country showed up to participate in the demonstrations in Selma. Sister Antona was in Selma for no more than about 8 hours. She came early in the morning and returned that evening. But her presence there made an impact. News reporters focused on Sister Antona because the sight of an African-American sister was so exceptional. And they asked her, why did you come to Selma? And here we can see what she said. I'm a Negro and proud of it. Being a Negro, I voted yesterday. Every citizen, every Negro citizen, as well as the whites, has a right to vote and should be given that right. And that's why I'm here today. Sister Antona became world famous for that picture, which was run the following day on the front page of the New York Times. Sister Antona had a long history with Catholicism. She was not born Catholic, but was a convert who was exposed to Catholicism during an illness. She had contracted tuberculosis and was instructed by a Catholic chaplain. She was baptized and went to Catholic schools and wanted to go to a Catholic nursing school. Just wanted to aspire to be a sister. You can see her. See here, she was Betty before she was Sister Antona. But the Catholic nursing schools turned her down until she was finally accepted in St. Louis among the first 3 Black sisters to be admitted to this particular branch of the Franciscan sisters. But they were still required to live in separate quarters and to take their meals separately. Despite this segregation, she persisted, she was a nurse first and then became a medical records librarian. Because the sisters were somewhat cloistered, they did not have a television and they did not learn about Bloody Sunday. She did not learn about Bloody Sunday until she came to work next Monday. Everyone at the infirmary was talking about it. And Sister Antona said, well, somebody should go down and do something about that. Later that day, she got an invitation from her superior saying, there's a group going down to Selma. Would you like to go with them? Sister Antona said, I felt like God was calling my bluff. And despite her concern for her safety, she did decide to go down there. Later in her career, she became a hospital administrator, a hospital chaplain, and passed away only a couple of years ago. And throughout her career, she was a strong advocate for civil rights. Okay, now. When I interviewed Sister Antona several years ago, one of the things I appreciated about her was her marvelous sense of humor. Whoops, excuse me. And she delighted in telling the story of going back to Selma. She went back to Selma 20 years after her demonstration. This time she was better received and got a key to the city from the mayor. The mayor, when he was introduced to her, was rather surprised. You can see here, he said, we wondered what became of that little colored lady they dressed up like a nun. Whites in Selma could not believe that a Black woman could be a Catholic sister. Sister Antona liked to tell the story of when she first came to Selma. She was greeted by a young woman, a girl, who ran up and just embraced her. She was so happy to see an African-American sister. It was the first time that she had encountered someone like that. Okay. Lawrence Giat is along with Diane Nash, is someone who devoted many years of his life to the civil rights movement. I'm going to call him Giat because that's what everybody in the movement called him. Rarely did they use his first name. Giat is a native Mississippian, but he came from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, which was a very different situation than the rest of the state. Pas Christian had a large French influence and a large Catholic population, both among whites and African Americans. Giat was educated in the Catholic schools, and if we were able to show the film clip, he would have told you that Catholic schools on the Gulf Coast were desegregated in 1957. People are a little incredulous when they hear about that because the Gulf Coast was very atypical of the rest of Mississippi. There were strong labor unions and the Catholic Church was well respected, and African Americans were allowed to vote in the counties along the Gulf Coast and did not encounter the same kind of racism that they did in other parts of the state. When Giat went to college, he chose Tougaloo College outside of Jackson. And Tougaloo was a hotbed of the civil rights movement. There he met Martin Luther King and many of the other leading civil rights advocates of the day. He joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1962, and as a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he was engaged in voter registration work in Greenwood, Mississippi. Greenwood was one of the most dangerous places to do voter registration, and he and his fellow voter registration workers encountered numerous attempts to drive them out of town. On one occasion, he was returning from a workshop with Fannie Lou Hamer. The bus stopped in Winona, Mississippi. One of the African-American women decided that she would try to integrate the lunch counter at the bus stop, and all of the Black people were jailed. Giat was beaten savagely. People who saw him when he came out of jail said his face looked like a piece of hamburger. But that did not stop him. He continued to be involved, and his most notable involvement was with the Freedom Democratic Party. It was an attempt by African Americans to organize a political party that would be racially integrated, since the Democratic Party of the state was not open to African Americans. The Freedom Democratic Party sent a delegation to the Democratic Convention in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964. They argued that the all-white Democratic delegation should not be seated at the convention, and the Freedom Democratic Party should be seated because they were the people who subscribed to the platform of the Democratic Party. They failed, but they continued their activism. In 1965, they tried to prevent the 5 congressmen from Mississippi, from taking their seats in the House of Representatives. They got 132 representatives to vote in favor, but that still was short of the majority. 1968, he was a delegate from Mississippi to the convention, and at that time, Mississippi sent a racially integrated delegation. After earning a law degree, he moved to the District of Columbia and was a political activist there. The quote that I like from him is the one that you see here: "Getting people organized to bring about political change is as necessary today as it was in 1955. Whoops. Okay. Our next Catholic in the civil rights movement, as you can see, is Father George Clements. And we've got this marvelous video. I encourage you to, when you're done here, to Google Father George Clements and listen to his interview, because he is certainly a very remarkable individual in terms of being a Black Catholic priest at a time when very few African Americans were Catholic priests. Now, it looks like I might have made a mistake and put up the wrong slide here, but I want you to look above Sister Antona. This gentleman wearing the Roman collar with the Homburg and the glasses, this is Father George Clements in Selma, Alabama in 1965. He was at that time the assistant pastor at St. Dorothy's Catholic Church, and in 1963 had taken a delegation to the March on Washington. St. Dorothy's had a part of a charter train. He was the first African American to graduate from the seminary. This is the junior seminary in Chicago. He was the second African American who was ordained as a diocesan priest. There were a number of other African American priests in Chicago, but they were all parts of various religious orders. He marched on Washington, he marched in Selma, but the main reason that we're focusing on Father Clements is because he got in hot water supporting the Black Panthers, the Chicago branch of the Black Panthers. And if you're familiar with the story of the Black Panthers, you know that Fred Hampton, the charismatic leader of the Chicago Black Panthers, was shot down, killed by the Chicago Police Department when they raided the headquarters. Father Clements had supported the Black Panthers, had allowed them to meet at his parish. At that time, he was the pastor of Holy Angels Parish in Chicago. And some people referred to him as the chaplain of the Black Panthers. He spoke at the funeral for Fred Hampton, and something that was not appreciated by the hierarchy in the city of Chicago. Holy Angels Parish was surrounded by housing projects in Chicago. And if you know anything about the housing projects, you know that was a very difficult place to live. But Father Clements built a thriving African American parish at Holy Angels. One of the first things he said as when he was appointed pastor is that we are not going to look to white Catholics to support our work here. We are going to be self-sufficient. And he was successful in raising the money to operate the parish and the parish elementary school, which was the largest Black Catholic elementary school in the country. What probably got Father Clements more attention was his desire to adopt young boys who were not, well, these were preteens. They were at an age when they were not adoptable. And he became the first Catholic priest in the United States to adopt a child. He was a strong advocate of adoption, saying that Black children should be raised in Black families. He not single-handedly, he had people helping him, but he tried to limit the impact of drug dealers by going to local convenience stores and telling them to not to sell drug paraphernalia, and certainly did not endear himself to the drug dealers in Chicago. He was a strong advocate of Catholic education, as I mentioned previously, and was successful in building a thriving parish and church in a very difficult neighborhood. One of his fellow priests says that Father Clements challenged the church to get out from behind stained glass windows and dogma and start dealing with real issues. More than any other person in the country, he's credited with giving credibility, making the Catholic Church credible for African Americans. I have to thank Dr. Kim for referring me to this book that came out just recently, Authentically Black and Truly Catholic. The author, Matthew Kressler, has written extensively about Father Clements and his crusade to make the Catholic Church more open and accepting of African Americans and African American culture. So if you're looking for a little extracurricular reading, I would definitely encourage you to look at Authentically Black and Truly Catholic. I'm going to say here that unless we have people in our audience today who are from Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi in particular, you may not be familiar with Dr. Albert Britton. Dr. Britton hails from Clark County, Mississippi. If you were to go to the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, you would see a bronze tablet engraved with Clark County, Mississippi, and you would see the names of 6 lynching victims from Clark County. And the reason I'm familiar with Clark County is that there are many African Americans in Albany, New York, who originally came from Clark County. It was very rural and certainly one of the most racist places in Mississippi. In spite of that, young Mr. Britton was an outstanding student at Tureaud College, went to Howard University Medical School, and returned to Mississippi, where he established a general practice in the city of Jackson. He had a specialty in obstetrics and gynecology and delivered hundreds of African American children. But the reason we're talking about, Dr. Britton became a Catholic and was very active in his local church. The reason we're talking about Dr. Britton is because of his involvement with the Mississippi State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Civil Rights Commission was established by the legislature. I should also mention that Medgar Evers was one of Dr. Britton's patients. The night that Medgar Evers was shot, he rushed to the University Medical Center, where The body of Medgar Evers had been taken, but by the time he arrived there, Medgar Evers was already dead. So the Civil Rights Commission, established in 1957, was commissioned to hold hearings and issue reports to the President and the Congress. And during the early part of the 1960s, they held very influential hearings, especially around the issues of voting rights and the African American denial of voter registration. Each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia had a local advisory commission, and this is the body that Dr. Britton served on. And they similarly held hearings and issued reports about civil rights in Mississippi. He was appointed to the Mississippi Committee in 1959 and eventually became the chair of that committee. Now, you might think that this was not a particularly heroic business, but because the Civil Rights Commission, the Advisory Commission, was advocating for integration, they became targets of the rabid segregationists in the state of Mississippi. And when the Advisory Commission issued a report on the administration of justice, the harassment of members, the threats against them, the phone calls in the middle of the night escalated. The white woman who had been the chair of the advisory committee was forced to leave the state of Mississippi when a cross was burned in front of her home. Dynamite was thrown at her home, and her husband was threatened with being fired. It was under those circumstances that Dr. Britton became the chair and continued to chair the advisory committee into the 1970s. So what was it that got him and the other members of the commission in trouble? They issued a report that said the state government is not concerned about the denial of the equal protection of the laws, and that the president should investigate, the Department of Justice should investigate the abuse by state and local officials, and should initiate criminal proceedings on those responsible for these actions. I don't have a photo of Dr. Britton testifying before the Civil Rights Commission, but here he is in 1967 testifying before a committee of the United States Senate who was traveling to Mississippi to collect information on employment, manpower, and poverty. The final person I'm going to be talking about here is Father Albert McKnight. Father McKnight was a member of the Congregation of the Holy Spirit, known sometimes as the Holy Ghost Fathers. They changed their name because somehow they didn't, Holy Ghost was not getting the reception that they wanted. So Father McKnight was born in Brooklyn, 1927, entered the Congregation of the Holy Spirit at the age of 20, was ordained in 1952, 25 years old. And the Congregation of the Holy Spirit was a missionary group. And they missionaries in the United States as well as overseas. And Father McKnight was sent to southwestern Louisiana, Lafayette, and other places in that vicinity, in the Cajun country, which is very heavily Catholic. it was through his advocacy of cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, that Father McKnight joins this group. The civil rights movement was primarily focused on gaining political rights for African Americans. And economics was not the leading issue, but for Father McKnight, it was. And he founded the Southern Consumers Cooperative and the Southern Cooperative Development Fund. Now, I know we're not going to be able to hear him, but I do want to show you just a little bit of this film clip about Father McKnight and his work.
The thing that struck me when I first came to Louisiana and spent my first 4 years strictly in what you would call church work was how irrelevant much of my preaching was when trying to preach to people who were hungry, trying to teach Christian morality to a family of 12 living in a two-room, discuss the possibility of getting...
Whoops, let me go back here just a bit.
Yes, Dr. Murray, we could actually hear that one. It looks like, yeah, it looks like you can turn it up a little bit. See that little...
Yes, I will turn it up. Well, good.
Fantastic. Woo! All right, thank you.
At last, I should have tried it sooner.
Well, some of them you couldn't turn up. We could see that. But
okay.
While we're taking a short break, everyone, please send questions that you're having into the chat, and we'll also try to take a few questions where we hear people's voices too. So if you start doing that, that'll be great.
Work was how irrelevant much of my preaching was when trying to preach to people who were hungry, trying to teach Christian morality to a family of 12 living in a two-room house. And I see that there's a close association between taking care of the needs of the body and administering to the spiritual needs of people. Delcombe here is a fishing town. That's where most of the people earn their livelihood. And yet there's not one black person who owns a boat. And we discussed the possibility of getting loans from the Farmers Home Administration for them to buy a boat. They finally granted a loan to a group of 3. And last year happened to be a bumper crop for shrimp and oysters. And we were hoping to get the boat at the beginning of the season, but with all the red tape, the loan didn't come through till actually at the end of the season, and they finally got the boat.
Well, I enjoyed the soundtrack for that film. The Father McKnight came from Brooklyn. He became a fan of the indigenous music there, both the Cajun music and the Zydeco music, and probably the food as well.
I think we're on the last person he's talking about, though. But then there's Q&A.
Okay.
Are you listening to it?
I'm listening and watching.
Okay.
On your phone?
Yeah.
Okay, so Father McKnight left this, which he hoped to be his epitaph. When I die, I hope to still be on the battlefield, struggling against racism and the inequities of the capitalist system. When I die, I hope to be speaking the truth, as I believe Jesus taught the truth. When I die, I hope to be never compromising values and following the dictates of my conscience, demanding justice now. Okay. So we've got half a dozen, 7 Catholics listed here. There are more Catholics in the civil rights movement? Certainly. This is the delegation at the March on Washington from St. Dorothy's Parish in Chicago. I can't see Father McKnight in that picture, but he was part of that group. Certainly there were more Black Catholics in the civil rights movement than the ones that I've mentioned. I suspect many of them worked quietly in the background without attracting a great deal of publicity. Others may never have been recognized as being Catholic, who were part of the movement. Some of the hierarchy were not enthusiastic about Catholics getting involved in the civil rights movement, and that was another barrier. But I'm sure there are many stories out there that remain untold. And so that is one of the reasons I eagerly took this assignment today. I'm eager for your comments and your questions. And if you know of other Black Catholics active in the civil rights movement, I certainly would like to know about them. I would be very grateful to hear about them.